The larger context and focus of the study, our major research problems were questions: what are pre-service teachers' beliefs about learning and teaching language and literacy when they enter the program? And what do pre-service teachers need to know about learning and teaching language and literacy? Margot is going to go right into a question about appropriate use, their views of appropriate use of different types of texts.
Okay. We deliberately left our question broad. We didn't want them to think about reading instruction, but rather what a classroom literacy program might look like and the kinds of texts that they would use in their literacy program. The choice of books, well, this book I went to speak to Phyllis Simon at Kids Books. I wanted a book that was very popular with students about grade 2. And she said this particular series of books flies off the shelf, her words. So I looked at it and there was so much about it I just loved. I mean, The Sky Above Fretnin Forest. I mean, you've got to be British, right? Lazy tongue, Fretnin. And the fact that the main character is a wolf who's probably 7 or 8. And so he's writing the way his readership would write. So there's lots of sort of invented spelling. Sorry about the scribble. And this is a flying air letter. It sort of has a kind of a playfulness with language which I really liked. I love high-upness. It's frilly and kiss-kiss, and the wind takes your breath and pinch your ears and your fur back. The second book, as Marlene pointed out, it shows because it's the kind of thing you'd see in a guided reading program, very controlled vocabulary, a lot of sort of help from the illustrations, so they have that illustration text sort of support, and it's highly patterned. So it's the kind of thing you would see in a guided reading or a reading instruction class. Guess what they thought about this one? They loved it. They absolutely loved it. They thought it was absolutely suitable for primary. They really did recognize that the importance of the sort of picture-text relationship and the predictable decodable text. So I was actually very impressed with that. There were only 9 people who didn't like it, and I felt they had a point. Too simple, boring, and not challenging. The first book we thought would be really suitable for sort of independent reading, take-home reading program, that kind of thing. The second one we really thought was for instruction and for guided reading. And this one we thought would make a terrific sort of read aloud or independent reading book. It's a piece of literature, unlike, well, I suppose you could say Little Wolf was, but it's really an established piece of literature. As you can see in this nifty chart, 389 of the respondents thought they would absolutely use I Can See, that little decodable text. 303 would use gorilla, and only 91 would use wolf. This told us a couple of things. That we really need to think about, when we're in our reading course, we really need to think about broadening students' idea about what a literacy program looks like in a classroom. It's not just about instruction. It's about really having a broad range of reading possibilities in your classroom, and certainly independent reading interest and motivation should be a big part of your reading program. And also that we really need to introduce to students the texts and materials of a broad reading program. So that 533 comments about literacy skills, questions about literacy skills, 527 for language background, and then they were interested in their background, in their educational background itself, so preschool experiences, when they began to read and write, that kind of thing. And then the other 3 were way down the scale: literacy enjoyment, family information, which I found actually particularly interesting, things around their socio-economic background and their cultural background, and then special needs. So those were the 6 kind of meta-levels, themes that we picked out. When Marlene and I were talking about this, we really felt that what we were seeing, and we'll have to look at it further, was that what we're seeing are students looking for not funds of knowledge, that children aren't arriving with an incredible knowledge of language, coming from an extraordinary variety of backgrounds, that they bring an incredible amount of cultural knowledge with them, that yes, indeed, they've had experiences with literacy, but perhaps not in the kind of ways that the school values. We think that that's not what we're seeing from these questions, but rather we're seeing a sort of reductive These are things I'm going to have to deal with as a teacher. They're arriving ill-prepared for school. Almost, that's the kind of thing we're picking up, we think, from this, but we're just beginning to look at it, so we're not entirely certain.
There is, I think, an important issue here to address, which is the distinctions that Michael Halliday introduced in 1979 in a conference in Canberra between learning language, learning through language, and learning about language. In literacy discussions, this has become common currency. And what we're particularly interested in is this question of learning about language, for in itself because of the significance of language in the curriculum, but also as a base so that students will be able to understand some of the processes of learning through language and where their students are positioned in terms of their access to knowledge represented through language. This is departing a little bit from the survey, but just to illustrate the general issue. Commonly, I think we can talk about three strata of language: meanings, structure, some people might use syntax, and lexis there, people would say lexicogrammatical structure, and then graphology, phonology. Down here is what often you see the debates about in terms of phonemic awareness and relations between phonemes and graphemes in English particularly. When we're talking about lexicogrammar, typically people are talking about classes of items when they are wondering about people's knowledge of grammar. There's a real problem about this, because if we think in terms of education being particularly interested in text of various kinds, then it's not easy to move from a description of classes of items up to text. Very, very long way to travel, and knowledge of classes of items, in my view at least, and I think it's shared by several of my colleagues, doesn't equip you very well to be able to talk about meaning construction in text. So probably at some point we need in our program to be thinking about functionally organised descriptions of language. If we have that in place for our students, we're in a much better position to be able to encourage them to talk about how texts are organised to make meaning. A really significant issue, I think, for our teacher education program to consider in terms of the pedagogical grammar. Work with, particularly when I was in Sydney, suggested that even kids as young as 6 could quite readily access grammatical description. How do you get at student knowledge about grammar? So what we tried to do, as you saw in the task that Marlon introduced, was to give them isolated examples of use, and then to pose the question as to whether they thought the structure that they had been presented with should be changed, if so why, and what was the reason for the need for it to be changed. If you were to suggest to a child that something needed to be changed, on what basis would you be making that professional judgment? And then a second task was to provide them with some fairly carefully constructed tasks of clauses, many of which involve, for example, embeddings in noun phrases, so quite complex structures, and ask them just simply to describe, say what they could about the structure. And the interesting thing is that the results for here are entirely consistent with the results for here in terms of the kind of knowledge that the students produce. Our elementary teacher education program includes students with very rich language backgrounds. 61% of them say that they are bilingual, trilingual. There are 29 first languages apart from English spoken in our group. So one question that I've got is, are we actually making sufficient use of this extraordinary background in our teacher education program? Are there ways that we could benefit much more from what the students bring to our program? They don't by and large think that Shakespeare used the best English that was ever spoken. About 20% of them we could identify as having very strongly conservative attitudes to characterise them broadly. But the vast majority of them are not like that at all. We asked them, is accent a reliable, or we made a proposition to them, accent is generally a reliable predictor of people's intelligence, and they're quite dismissive of that. About 89 or so percent have experienced grammar in elementary education, 93% in secondary education, many in second language instruction. About 50% have learned some grammar at least at tertiary level, and the majority in English classes. So then the question of what sort of knowledge will they produce? These pre-service teachers do not have a working knowledge of grammatical structure that would enable them to intervene to support young children's development of systematic knowledge about language. Ordinary students use it. They simply don't, despite all that instruction. And so our question has to be, how do we best support them? What can we do now? I think personally, this is something that we need to talk much more about, but just to record a personal view, I think the last thing we need to do is just have a few classes in 310 or 320 on grammar. That's not going to be enjoyable. A partial solution might be to introduce an elective course, but of course that's not going to make it easy for all of them. Probably one of the best ways to do it would be to introduce some really rich web-based resources. What we're trying to get at through this is the question of their resourcefulness in being able to reflect on language and to understand learning through language processes. Further, more general question, I think, which is it useful to have a sense of English as a system, up to some level in detail anyway. So major features of how the system of grammar works and what its implications are for meaning.